Biodiversity has co-evolved with regular cycles for millennia. The ebb and flow of the tide, the changing of the seasons, or regular events which define an ecosystem. The floodplains wouldn't exactly be floodplains without floods. But what happens when those regular cycles are a little more extreme than normal? In today's video, we are going to cover hurricanes, topads, and evolutionary ratchets. This is a really fascinating, interconnected suite of research that I've been diving into lately for Learn Adventurously. Now, the information we're talking about today stems from the research here from Donihue et al. Hurricane-induced selection on the morphology of an island lizard. This is a really cool body of research that I've been following for several years now. To put it very, very simply, in 2017, Hurricane Irma and Maria smashed into islands within Turks and Caicos. However, right before those hurricanes hit the islands, the research team, Donihue et al., they had actually measured the topad and the limb length of the Anole lizards on the islands. These were Anolis scriptus lizards. So once the hurricanes had passed, they came back and remeasured the lizards to see how do hurricanes affect lizards. And the results were really surprising, but we're going to take a step back in this video to first ask, what would we expect to see given that, well, hurricanes are a regular event and a natural event in an ecosystem? Now, we actually have a pretty good set of theory and research on what happens in areas following some disturbance, right? So let's say we have a habitat like we have here, and this habitat previously, it hasn't been disturbed in a whole long while. So it's a forest. We're not talking an old growth forest here. This is, maybe 75, 80 years since the last major disaster, right? So we still have some really nice old growing trees. But of course, we have more than just trees in a forest. We have some shrubbier plants that exist around the trees. And essentially, we just have, diversity. And then let's also add some grassy plants here in red. We'll just keep them different colors just to make them a little more clear. So, of course, what happens whenever a disaster comes through, right? Let's say this is our island ecosystem and the hurricane came through and it destroyed all of the trees, right? It took down every single tree, high winds, boom, it, destroyed the tree. It also ripped up this shrub, but now we have basically no more trees in this little patch of habitat, right? We have some shrubs, some grassy plants that survive, but for all intents and purposes, this habitat was heavily degraded. It was destroyed, right? Well, what do we expect to happen? Well, we know about ecological succession, right? We know that there's going to be some early colonizing plants that come in. Typically, these are going to be things like your grasses. Often, these are plants that are already contained within the soil before the disaster. And so now that the area has been cleared, the trees have been knocked down and the canopy layer has opened up, allowing the rays of the sun to penetrate and reach these grasses. Well, now they can start to grow. Well, given enough time, right, what else are we going to see? Given enough time, these grasses are going to grow, but we also are going to see more shrubs taking the place, right? We'll start to see some of these larger plants, these a little bit more long-lived plants start to recolonize. Often these grasses live on a 1-year life cycle, so they just kind of sprout up as quick as they can, figure out how to produce their genetic material and then spread it out into the ecosystem. Well, again, we're talking about ecological succession. So what happens with even more time? Well, we know that in this ecosystem, there were an abundance of trees. And it's very likely that during some of these early successional stages, we can already start to see little saplings of the trees sprouting up, right? We can see those start to sprout in amongst the grasses and the shrubs. This is something you'll see pretty often in pine savanna habitats after a wildfire. You'll start to see the pines actually sprout up a little bit earlier than you'd expect. And that's because they've actually been producing a very elaborate root system that is sort of there lying in wait, gaining nutrients, waiting for the moment that a disturbance occurs for the trees to sprout up in a very quick stage. It's actually called the rocket stage in pine trees. But again, as we know, over time, we are going to have the restoration of that ecosystem, right? All of these saplings are going to grow up into the trees. And what we have is an ecosystem. Maybe we'll also have a few less shrubs and a few less grasses from this. But what we have is an ecosystem that now resembles the starting point, right? We have an ecosystem that resembles the habitat before the disaster. And this is something that occurs in nature often. On this time scale, we were talking about a massive disaster, right? Something that only happens every now and then, but it also occurs on smaller time scales. Just the regular cycles of the season have an influence on what species are growing, what species are present in an area. We can also look to the wet season and the dry season, right? At one part of the year, it is saturated with water. There's a heavy abundance of rain. And then another part of the year, it is dry. And the organisms that exist in those habitats have co-evolved with those systems. These organisms are, in a way, adapted to the regular cycles around them. And that is something we really need to think about, because if we can accept that these regular cycles occur in seasons, if we can accept that floodplains will flood on some regular basis, then what is our assumption when it comes to natural disasters? Remember, we are talking about the size of the topads here. So what they were measuring was the area of these topads. Now, if you're not familiar with Anole topads, these are an evolutionary adaptation that enable them to climb much easier. They can actually climb up, some species can climb up smooth surfaces like glass thanks to these adhesive topads. They're a really, really fascinating and diverse trait that actually reveals a lot about a particular lizard species. So what did they find? Donihue et al. Found that after the hurricanes, the average topad area increased, and by a significant amount. So if you have the distribution of toe sizes in this topad sizes in the Anole population here in this normal distribution, the new distribution would have been skewed towards the larger topad sizes, just like this, right? Now, this is actually an example of directional selection. It is moving towards some phenotype. But how can we say this is selection? How can we actually look at this and say, oh, this is natural selection? We can tell because they're bigger, right? Well, it's because this trait was not neutral. So let's look at these populations in a different way. Say we have a graph like this that represents toe size, and each of these data points is going to represent an individual anole. So what we have are that larger individuals are higher up. They have a larger topad size, right? So then we have these smaller individuals, right? We'll represent them with these green and, well, smaller circles. And so these are going to be maybe the medium topad size, right? So this might be the average topad size in the area, and then the reds represent the larger extremes, right? The quartiles that are towards the larger end of our range. And then naturally, we're going to have some smaller topad size anoles, right? So what do we expect to happen when a hurricane hits our island anoles, right? How do we expect these populations to change after the hurricane, right? Well, if we expect this trait to be neutral, if we expect topad size to have no effect on the survival of these lizards, we would expect, let's just put this over to the side for now, if it had no effect on survival, we would expect about an equal proportion of lizards from all toe sizes to perish in the hurricane. We would expect essentially something that looks like this, right? So the x-axis doesn't matter here. Doesn't really matter. We're just looking at toe size here. And so we see, okay, yeah, look, about the same number of large, medium, and small topad size anoles perished in the hurricanes. And what happens is the average topad size doesn't change. But this pattern is not what Donihue et al. Saw. Instead, what they saw looked more similar to this. It looked way more similar to the smaller topad anoles perishing, while the larger ones survived. In essence, we have a completely different pattern after the hurricane than we would expect if this trait was neutral. So again, this one right here, neutral. This one right here, not neutral. So usually in these evolutionary studies, this is what we first do. We just say, is this trait neutral? How would we expect the trait to behave if it were neutral? And if it is not neutral, why? Why is it not neutral? So they said that there may be some other explanations. There's, of course, the potential for gene flow, right? Maybe a population of large topad-sized anoles was brushed off from the mainland and got deposited on the islands due to the hurricanes, right? However, it should be noted that this pattern was found on 2 different islands. And there's also some follow-up research which confirms it, it's probably not that. Instead, it could have been mutation as well, right? Mutation is the other evolutionary force, but it definitely wasn't mutation because mutation acts so slowly. And we're assuming here that the population on the island, if there were, 100 lizards on the island before the hurricane, now we're assuming there's maybe 50. We're assuming that many perished or were removed from the island in some other means. So that really leaves us with natural selection. And of course, we could postulate all the different explanations for why natural selection operates in this way. The main one that actually has garnered a good amount of follow-up research is that it increases grip strength, right? Remember, these topads are for grip. They are for climbing. They are for, holding on. So being able to hold on better during hurricane winds would make sense that lizards would survive if they have larger topads. And in fact, some of the follow-up research here has actually looked into this. So you can see here that the lizard is being blown off by strong winds. If I remember correctly, yep, it was with a leaf blower. So they just put a leaf blower up to some lizards and say, hold on. And in doing this, though, they can actually reveal different, gripping capabilities between individuals that have that distribution of topad sizes. Or you can compare between species and see how do species with a larger topad size hold on to different sticks, right? So this is an emerging body of research, but I want to chuck in the last final interesting little tidbit for this entire thing, and that is the concept of the evolutionary ratchet, because it goes one layer deeper. They actually compared the size of the topads on different populations of anole and across different species, and then they attached onto that data the number of hurricanes those populations or species have experienced over the last 70 years. And what they found is that the more hurricanes a species or a population has experienced, the larger their topad size. And this is a trend that holds up across species. What? So I just really want to hammer in that point, that this is not some pattern we're seeing in a single isolated population of some island off, in the Turks and Caicos. This is a pattern that we actually see across life, across many species of anole. We see that with increasing hurricanes, there are larger topad sizes and also associated changes in limb morphology. Usually it seemed to be shorter forelimbs because that helps them hold on in some way, right, when they're holding onto that stick. So what we can really glean from this is something called an evolutionary ratchet, right? It's that last little bit. So like we're talking about with our cycles, right? We expect species to return back to some starting point, right? We expect that after the massive cataclysmic flood that took out the trees, given enough time, the trees would come back, right? But we are seeing the breakage of a cycle in these anoles because, again, as more hurricanes have occurred, we have larger towpaths. But think about this. In that study, do you know the largest number of hurricanes these species exhibited? It was 4. 4 in 70 years. So there were decades which passed in between these hurricanes. And anoles are typically assumed to have a 1-year generation time. So we're talking about dozens of generations have passed in between these hurricanes, yet this pattern still remains. What we would expect over time in even these island populations where we just measured it, we would expect that over time, we would see the return to that starting point of diversity. Yes, the large anole towpad, the large towpad anoles all survived the hurricane while the small ones perished, but there was that diversity present before the hurricane. Those small towpad-sized anoles were surviving. So it stands to reason that as the habitat restores after the hurricane, as the trees start to regrow and start to recolonize, and we see more and more plants go back towards that initial starting state, we would expect our anoles to also go back to their starting state, yet they don't. As the hurricanes come through, they just have bigger and bigger towpaths. And that is the super fascinating research here. It's something called an evolutionary ratchet. If you think like a ratchet wrench can only ratchet in one direction, right? You can only tighten, you can only loosen, but you can't do both. That's what the ratchet is doing. It's saying that, hey, the towpad size is only getting bigger. It's never going back to that smaller average size. It's just getting bigger and bigger. So that's where that ratchet analogy comes into play. And you'll actually see it pretty often in the literature. It tends to pop up a little more often than people realize. Now, there's a rich body of research that has been emerging from this initial observation, and the effects of hurricanes on wildlife and ecosystems has had a decent amount of study over the last few decades. In fact, it's actually why over in the Learn Adventurously Bio Club, we are covering this paper and a few other concepts related to natural disasters in wildlife. So we actually covered some of the concepts that we've touched upon in this video, like natural selection and drift, but we also have a full paper discussion breakdown, which just goes through the paper, has some official sources and some additional information. So again, this is all for lab members, but if you want to support all this free educational material that we're putting out there, again, you can join the lab or you can just subscribe. Do all the things that YouTube tell you to do. And we are going to be doing more videos in this nature. I've been a little bit absent because I've been working on, the lab here, building out. So it's one of these things where I haven't made anything, but I've also produced over a dozen videos, a dozen educational lessons, all for the lab. So things like natural selection, just giving the basic explanation and a few examples. So so I'm going to stop doing my ad read because I need to end this video, and I hope y'all have a great day. And thank you for learning adventurously. Bye. See you in the next one.